Good morning. My name is Kurt Loche. I'm the president of the Little Canada Historical Society. I want to welcome you to this presentation on Ben and Genevieve Jarvis early history. It's very important to the city of Little Canada. This is the 175th anniversary of the founding of the Jarvis Mill in 1844. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce John Vanek. He's our presenter and a fifth great-grandson of the Ben and Jen Jarvis.
Hello. So we don't have, this mic is only for the TV back there. There's no mic to the speakers in here. I'll try to project, but please do at least be aware of the noise that you're making. Okay. Raise your hand if you are also a descendant of Ben and Genevieve. I know there are a whole bunch in here. So I think that's half of the room. I think that's half the reason that this went past 30 people. So I've got a lot to cover, and I'll just dive right in. So as Kurt said, 175 years ago, that is when Benjamin and Genevieve Gervais, or Benjamin Gervais, everybody calls him Jarvis. I might slip back and forth, forgive me. But Genevieve, I'm a lot better about pronouncing Genevieve Laurence, which is how it was pronounced, because a lot of the times it wasn't spelled like Lawrence here. It was spelled Larance, and I've smattered that into the presentation as well. So 175 years ago, that's what we're here to celebrate. Here is a quick overview of how this project came to be, and who I am first. So I'm John Vanek. I have a master's degree in history. I work as full-time as an exhibit developer. I have worked full-time as a professional genealogist for a few years. So I have sort of the right set of skills to go about doing this. Last year, I proposed the project to Kurt and the Little Canada Historical Society when I realized it was the 175th anniversary. And I had found just a few records, a couple of voyageur contracts that I thought no one had found before. They're not here in the folder, in the family folder for the Jarvises. And I wanted to sort of put something more complete together about the family. Well, the more I dug, the more I found. So this project grew to be quite large. So the Historical Society fundraised for this project to pay to acquire the documents, and to hire a translator, because I don't read French. I can make my way through a parish record pretty well. You know, I've learned my dates and I know how to find names and some of the key words like godparents, but I certainly can't read 200-year-old legal documents in a foreign language. So we hired Caroline Mayeur, who is a native of Quebec. She lives here in the Twin Cities, and she's active in the Minnesota Genealogical Society's Canadian Interest Group. She's here. I don't know if you want to raise your hand. She's in the back. So I would not have been able to do this without her. I sent her documents. She sent them back translated, and I used my historical knowledge and some of the things she had found to put together the story that we're going to be telling here. So why should we care about this story? I think everybody in the room has their own reasons for caring. But Little Canada is where it is because of this family. Benjamin and Genevieve were attractive people. People liked this family, and they congregated around them. They were also one of the founding fathers and mothers of St. Paul. So I think we ought to know what kind of people they were, and how their lives and how their personalities shaped the cities they helped to found. Another thing that I like to focus on is French Canadians as settlers. We hear so much about the French Canadians in the fur trade, but we don't really think about them as settlers. And they were, in much of the United States, they were the first wave of people to actually settle down on the land. And I want to present this because this is a success story. For all of you who have French Canadian ancestry, I went into this not sure I would find all that much, and I found a ton. And although we think Ben and Jen are important, people in their day didn't think they were really anything special. They were just regular people, illiterate farmers, and voyageurs. So I hope that this presentation gives you hope to go find your own ancestors out there in Canadian archives. And next year, I should mention that I've already agreed with the Canadian interest group of the Minnesota Genealogical Society to do a presentation that's specifically focused on sort of the how and how to work with these archives and how I found the stuff I did. I'll touch on those things as we go, but the story itself is pretty detailed here, so I want to make sure that we keep moving. So what did we know before I did this research? We knew a total of 5 sentences published in 1876. So everything that has been published about Benjamin and Genevieve's lives before coming to Minnesota in 1838 is based on 5 sentences published in 1876. That includes the Little Canada Voyager's Vision book that's here at the Historical Society that is really, really awesome at telling the story of Little Canada after that point. And that author did a great job with the early history of Benjamin and Genevieve based on what was known, and it wasn't that much. So we knew 5 sentences published in 1876 and a couple documents that people had uncovered before. People like Al Dahlquist, who's in the room, who have been doing research for the Historical Society for decades, and there's a huge collection here. So I wanted to just add to that. It certainly isn't to take anything away from the people who have done work before. Why didn't we know more? I think the first and primary reason, and I'm going to give an example of this, is Yankee chauvinism. So they didn't have that much interest in French Canadians or their history. They didn't think very highly of them. And the second reason is French Canadian illiteracy. Benjamin Jarvis and his entire family, and Genevieve and her entire family, were illiterate people. A lot of the early settlers, especially the ones that came in the 1830s and 40s, could not read. They couldn't write their own names. So they couldn't write their own names. They certainly weren't going to write a book about their history and how they got here. So it was an oral culture. If you think about the Voyageur songs, this was an oral culture, like many cultures of people who can't read and write. And later waves of immigrants, the Swedes and the Norwegians and the Germans and the Irish, their populations very quickly outnumbered the French Canadians. So when if you're a later historian and you want to write a history, sort of a big history of Minnesota, the French Canadians aren't that important after a very brief moment. But we still think it's important. So just to start out here, I want to give an example of why this history wasn't recorded back in the era when they were still alive. So this is Harriet Bishop. Some of you might recognize her name. She's there's a school named after her in St. Paul. So in 1857, she wrote the first history of St. Paul, and she came in 1847. So her history included information about the time before she was actually here. And here's what she had to say about the St. Paul of 1841. So upon a commanding bluff of the Mississippi, scattered here and there, were some half-dozen decayed and decaying log hovels, chinked with mud, and every way of the meanest appearance, evincing the lack of taste and ambition of the occupants. They were Low French and half-breeds, not just French, but Low French, and repudiated the forms and conventionalities of the world, of which they knew comparatively nothing. So this was her opinion of people like Ben and Jen who were living in those places. The nucleus of this village was a 10 by 12 log chapel, the site of which was marked by the Romish priest, again, a sort of derogatory way to talk about Catholicism, and more recently a christening service dignified the settlement with the name St. Paul. So the only thing dignified about St. Paul was the name, not the people, not the church, and not the buildings that they were living in. So no improvements had been made, she says, when in 1841, Henry Jackson with his young wife landed beneath the towering bluff. So here come the saviors, Yankees from the east, to actually bring civilization to St. Paul. Now, Bishop completely ignores the reason that all the houses of the French were in rough shape. The year before, the commandant at Fort Snelling had ordered all of the houses on the military reserve burned to the ground. Or destroyed. There's some debate about the details, but in any case, they had their houses destroyed. Of course, Major Plimpton at Fort Snelling, who was another Yankee. So she doesn't tell that part of the story, that they were literally starting from scratch with nothing, and they had been there for only a few months. Now, most of our story, what we did know, comes from A History of the City of St. Paul and the County of Ramsey, Minnesota by J. Fletcher Williams, and this is the 1876 book. And he was a proper historian. He was pretty disinterested. He didn't have, he certainly had biases. Everyone has biases, but he was pretty good about setting those aside. He wanted to interview the people who were alive, whoever they were, and put the story down to the best of his abilities. Now, he had also been a journalist, so he had little biographical sheets. So if anybody popped up in the news, he could go reference his index of people and have something to say about who they were, where they lived, what their business was. So he combined those notes with interviews and put together this book. And he interviewed Genevieve, he interviewed Pierre Jarvis, Benjamin's brother. I think, he doesn't say so explicitly, but I think he interviewed Alphonse, their eldest son. So here are the 5 sentences. This is what we knew before. It's actually not, it's more than you think it's going to be, but let's just go through it so we have a starting point. Benjamin Jarvis was born at Riviera de Loup, Canada, July 15th, 1786. About the year 1803, he went to the Red River in company with several Canadian families who settled there. Jarvis did not himself settle there that year, but made trading voyages back and forth to Canada until the year 1812, when he took up residence there and was in the employ of the Hudson's Bay Company for several years. On September 29th, 1823, he was married at Fort Garry by Bishop Provencher to Miss Genevieve Laurence, a native of Berthier, Canada, and went to farming at a place called La Pointe, about 1.5 miles below Fort Garry. Their story is that of all the Red River refugees, the floods, grasshoppers, untimely frosts, hard winters, etc., drove them away to a more habitable region, and in 1827, Mr. Jarvis, with his wife and 3 children, proceeded to Fort Snelling, near which they settled. So that's more detailed than you think, although if you're interested in Genevieve, you don't get much. And on this note, while we're still talking about J. Fletcher Williams, I think that this photograph, which is the only photograph known of this couple, I think that this was taken at the insistence of Williams when he was doing his interviews. The Historical Society, Minnesota Historical Society, dates this to about 1875, which is right before Benjamin died. And I suspect that he was responsible for that. So thank you, J. Fletcher Williams, for as much as we got out of the 19th century. So what were my research goals? That was my starting point. Like any other researcher, those 5 sentences were my starting point. I wanted to know, could I find, here in the 21st century, could I go find primary sources to verify that account or to correct it, to contradict it? Could I find anything new pieces that were not a part of that story? And could I really answer the question, why and how did Benjamin and Genevieve end up here, better than what had been written before? And now my goals for this presentation are to highlight all of the new records that I found. And I found a whole bunch. So this is getting into the weeds. So I want you to imagine that before we were in an airplane or a drone or something, we're looking down from a couple thousand feet. We can more or less follow when and where they moved, but we don't know anything about the details of their lives. And now we're going to get, in this presentation, a year-by-year, sometimes day-by-day look at their lives from birth until they arrived in Little Canada. So I'm going to let the documents lead the way. We're not going to talk about every document that I found, but you'll get to see the full range of sources. And then throughout, I'm going to provide historical context because some of them don't make any sense unless you know something about the time period that they were created or the people who were creating them. And throughout, I am going to sort of throw back to what we knew before and how this has changed, what we understand. So the first thing I want to talk about is just the broader historical context. People have some idea about French history and French Canadian history and Canadian history in general. But at a presentation I went to a couple weeks ago, there were a lot of questions from the audience that came, and they, one question was about the early settlers of French Canada, and then the next question was about settlement in the 19th century coming down into New England, and there wasn't a lot of agreement. People didn't have enough shared understanding to sort of know what we're talking about. So for this presentation, we're talking about the British era of Canadian history. So Great Britain conquered New France in 1760, and that was established in a treaty in 1763. In 1774, the British government passed the Quebec Act, which guaranteed religious freedom for Catholics in Quebec, restored French civil law in private matters, and expanded Quebec to include what became the future Northwest Territory. So for Americans, for American patriots 2 years before the revolution starts, this was one of the intolerable acts that set them on this course of revolution. How could you let Catholicism stand in the British Empire? How could you let foreign laws exist when you've conquered these people? And how can you give them to all this territory out in the West when New York and Virginia and some of the other colonies had been granted that land in their charters? But for French Canadians, this was a major reason that they, it gave them some loyalty to the British. They knew that if they, during the Revolution, if they sided with the Americans, they would be forced to assimilate. And the British government had promised them that they would not be forced to assimilate and speak English and convert their religion. So this, they didn't love the British. There was a lot of resentment for generations about the British government. However, they had at least made some concessions. So when we're talking about Benjamin and Genevieve's parents and their families growing up, this is what we're talking about. This is the time period in Canadian history. So let's dive in. We're going to start with looking at Benjamin's life, his early life, until he gets to the Red River. So William's sentence number 1 says Benjamin Jarvis was born at Rivière-du-Loup, Canada, July 15th, 1786. And that is wrong on every account. And I don't blame J. Fletcher Williams. I blame the people he was interviewing. So I blame Benjamin, Genevieve. I don't think Benjamin knew his own birth year. He didn't know his birthday. He didn't know when he was born. He didn't know where he was born. He filed 2 declarations of intention in the late 1840s to become a U.S. citizen, and both of those documents, filed 2 years apart, agree that his birthday was October 14th, 1787. He told J. Fletcher Williams that his birthday was July 15th, 1786. All of his obituaries have that date. Earlier census records from the Red River settlement suggest it was between 1789 and 1794. Still a 5-year range. And if we actually go find his baptism record, he was born July 3rd, 1792. So the date's wrong. The month is he gets the month right at the end, but he didn't get it right in the 1840s. This is one of the 2 records I mentioned that had been found before. So if you go across to the cemetery and look at the new gravestone that was put up, 10 or 15 years ago, it does have the correct birth date. So people like Al Dahlquist, I don't know if you were responsible for it, but somebody here did the research, found the baptism record, figured out there aren't any other Benjamins. This is definitely our guy. So that is correct. And here is that baptism record. I'm not going to make you read through all of these because it's handwriting and it's in French, and these are some of the documents that I'm going to be giving to the Historical Society. So one of the purposes of this project is to leave a record here. So all of the records I've found are going to come back to the Historical Society sometime this year, as soon as I get it all together in an organized way. So here's a French document, for example, and then I'm going to be giving the transcriptions and translations as well that Caroline did, so that the Historical Society has a complete record. Can you see that? No. Okay. Oh, did we lose it? We're up? Okay. So that the Historical Society has all these documents. This isn't just for one presentation. So let's dive in. Ben was born in Saint Genevieve de Batiscan, not in Rivière-du-Loup, and we'll talk about where those are. And he had fairly deep roots there. On his maternal side, his second great-grandfather was the very first person to to receive a land grant there, and most of his ancestors had settled or lived nearby. So here's our map. The red point is Saint Genevieve de Batiscan, and I've zoomed it out enough that you can see in the southwest, Montreal, and in the northeast, here's Quebec. So this is sort of in the district of Three Rivers in the middle, and that's where we're talking about where he was born. If we zoom in a little bit, we see that it's not right on the St. Lawrence, it's up the Batiscan River, and you see all these long lots. So these are French-style agricultural lots. We're used to here having the township system where everybody gets a nice square or pretty even rectangle. In French Canada, one of the things that I think they did better than us is everybody had access to water. So you would have a long lot, you'd have a narrow connection to the river, and then a long property back from there. But that way everybody had access to transportation. It was a little more equitable. And if we look actually at, this is a really early record of the original landowners from 1685 to 1709. We see this Lefebvre family show up multiple times in St. Genevieve de Batiscan. So that's pretty cool. I'm going to highlight this guy. This is a different maternal grandfather of his, Prisquet Junot. So one of the things I went looking for was sort of what's the culture here in these families? Is this a family, where generations of men have been voyageurs? Is that what got them to go west? And for Benjamin, in Benjamin's case, the answer is no. There's not a lot. The best I could find was that his maternal grandfather and his this Prisquet Junot and his brother Alexis went to Grand Portage and back once in the 1780s, and they were in their 40s, and that was it. So was that just like a, hey, let's do this before we get too old to do it? The other thing to think about is that the fur trade sort of died off after the British took over until it got up and running again from Montreal. So the French had sent people out west to Green Bay, to Michilimackinac in the throughout the early 1700s. But once the British took over, they had Hudson's Bay Company, and the Hudson's Bay Company operated through Hudson Bay. It's only in the 1780s that the Northwest Company is founded in Montreal that they start sending voyageurs back west through Grand Portage and up through northern Minnesota and into the far distant western and northern Canada. So this is the only connection, the only real connection I found to voyageuring in Benjamin's life. And one of the records I want to highlight, so this is, you don't have to necessarily order these records to get something out of them. So the website of the Centre du Patrimoine for the Société Historique de Saint-Boniface in Manitoba, in Winnipeg, has something called a Voyageur Contracts database on their website. And you can search it by name, and you get all sorts of detail without having to actually order and pay for the record. They've abstracted out most of the important information: the name, the date, where the contract was signed, the parish that the person came from. So when you're looking for people who have common French names, the parish is the way to separate them out. Who they signed with. So Benjamin and Joseph Frobisher, these are people who were involved in the Northwest Company. And then there's a little bit of detail down here. This is not the whole record, but it's most of it. So Benjamin's parents, let's zoom in a little closer here. Jean-Baptiste Gervais was born in 1766, so not long after the British took over. Their parents were born, and they were born in St. Genevieve de Batiscan. So Benjamin grew up where his parents had grown up and gotten married. Here's that marriage record. And so you can see the marriage of Jean-Baptiste, the son of François Gervais, and the deceased Marguerite, Brousseau, and Françoise, the daughter of Prisquet Junot, and Françoise Lefebvre. So I can make my way through parish records well enough. Now, 1789, some historical context for 1789. This is the year that George Washington was sworn in as president. This is the year that the Bill of Rights was first proposed in Congress. This is the beginning of the French Revolution in France. So just to sort of, help create some anchors for people who don't have a deep knowledge of history. So Benjamin grew up on this farm in St. Genevieve de Batiscan, and he had a bunch of siblings. He was the second child. So these are the ones that were born at St. Genevieve de Batiscan, and it was sort of digging through these siblings' records that you find the move to Rivière-du-Loup. So he did live in Rivière-du-Loup. He just forgot about the first 12 or 13 years of his life. So he was 12 or 13 years old. It's a move of about 45 miles, and I'll pull a map up for that. of that. His father was still just a farmer, and he also, he had more maternal ties. They're sort of following his mother's family here. His great-grandfather, Francois Lefebvre, had been married in Rivière-du-Loup. He had, back in the French era long ago, had been a voyageur to Green Bay in 1734, and that's where that record says he lived. And his second wife, Benjamin's great-grandfather, Catherine Richard, died there in 1787. So here's our map. Here is Saint Genevieve de Batiscan up in the northeast, and if we just move to the other side of Three Rivers, about the same distance, is what is now called Louisville. If you go on a visit to Canada and you want to go visit where Benjamin was born, or where Benjamin lived and signed a lot of his contracts, don't go to the town called Rivière-du-Loup. Louisville changed its name later in the 19th century to avoid confusion with another Rivière-du-Loup, which kept the name. So this is where you want to be going. So life in Rivière-du-Loup. Jean-Baptiste and Françoise purchased farmland along the Rivière-du-Loup, and they didn't really purchase farmland. All the documents sort of pretend that these are direct transactions buying and selling land, but in the French-Canadian system, it's one of the last semi-feudal systems, so there was actually a different landowner proper. These people were buying rights to tenancy. And at Rivière-du-Loup, they had a couple more children. One of the things that always confuses people about this family is that in 1810, they had a second child. The baptism record calls him Pierre. They already had a Pierre, and he was still alive. And for most of his life, if you look at records in the United States, for this Pierre, he goes by Pierre or Peter. Every once in a while, he's called Louis. And the Canadian records are equally confused about whether he's Pierre or Louis, but he's definitely the same guy. So we'll try to keep track of him. He throws in these two Pierres throw a wrench in a couple places in upcoming records. So Benjamin is a teenager. He's growing up. He's having, he's got a lot more younger siblings. That last Pierre is 17 and a half years younger than him. And he signs his first labor contract. So this is one of the records that got me so excited and got me digging deeper. So here you see Benjamin Gervais of de la Rivière-du-Loup, and he signs a contract to go to La Baie des Quinty. So where is that? And he signs it with, let's see if I can find it, Donald McLennan. So who is this? What's going on? I've never heard anything about this. It's not in J. Fletcher Williams' account at all. It's September 28th, 1809. He's 17. And he's hired by Donald McLennan of Glengarry County, Upper Canada, which is now Ontario, in the quality of day laborer, going to the Bay of Quinty to work as a day laborer for Donald McLennan until the 1st of May next year, his time beginning today. So it's the end of September, and he's going to work on the shore of Lake Ontario for the winter, for the fall, the winter, and the spring. Any guesses what he was doing? Yes, freezing is right, and you're also right, but it took a little while to figure out that. So he was paid 54 livres per month, and McLennan hired two other men on the very same day, and they got 75 livres per month. I don't think there's a big question why. He was 17, and this was his first job. You usually don't pay those people the big bucks until they. We'll get to that. So we'll get to that. So one of the things is, who is Donald McLennan and what's Benjamin doing on the Bay of Quinty? Because the contract doesn't say. He's just working as a day laborer for this guy. So 10 days earlier, McLennan signed a contract with someone named Paul Perrault in Quebec City, and I requested that contract, and they couldn't find it. So they went and actually looked at the physical paper contracts, not just the microfilm, and it's missing. So this is the document that I think would spell out this Paul Perrault hiring McLennan to say, you go down to the Bay of Quinty and do X. So that was the easy route, and it's missing. So now we're going to zoom out really far to understand why Benjamin Jarvis was doing what he was doing, and what it was that he was doing. So 1809, there's war. War has been raging between England and France for years now, for most of the decade. The U.S. tried to remain neutral in this war, trading with both Great Britain and France. Now, that didn't please either one of them, who thought that the United States was trading with the enemy. So the British blockaded French ports so that Americans could no longer trade with the French. And this is the famous British Navy. And the British were impressing American sailors. They would board American ships and take those sailors, say, "You're British, you're lying about it, and you're now a sailor on one of our ships." So one of the American responses, one of the first one, was the Embargo Acts of 1807 and 1808. So Jefferson embargoed all trade with both Great Britain and France. His goal was to make them miss American trade, and by cutting all trade off with them. It didn't work because America was really weak and was just a minor, a sideshow on the world stage, and they didn't really miss trade with us. It was hugely unpopular in America because it hurt. Americans still relied on a lot of basic manufactured goods from England, necessities and luxury items, and American merchants in Boston and Philadelphia and New York were furious that their businesses were ruined. So hugely unpopular in America. But before the embargo, Vermont supplied a lot of Canada's timber. So they cut it in Vermont and then floated it up the Richelieu River, and then especially downriver into Quebec City. They were supplying trees that were so perfect that they became masts on British warships. But this was the trade that had gotten going. Americans usually were ahead of the game on this, through most of our history. Well, that trade was cut off. There was plenty of smuggling, but it was still unreliable and risky to do. So during the embargo, Canadian merchants seized the opportunity and began to hire Canadian laborers to cut and raft timber. And they did it at two places. They did it on the Ottawa River, and that initial lumber camp there is basically the foundation of Ottawa City. And they went to the Bay of Quinte on Lake Ontario, the north shore of Lake Ontario. So in the spring of 1809, one of the Northwest Company, one of the sub companies within that, they signed a contract for 70 to 80,000 pipe staves to be delivered to Quebec City, and other companies and merchants were there too. So most of those contracts, this is looking more broadly, so looking at some of the other contracts people signed to go to the Bay of Quinte, said very clearly only to make timber rafts and to descend with them to Montreal. So you can see different contracts. Benjamin is there to cut the timber. He's a lumberjack. And some of these other folks are here to take the timber rafts and float them downriver to the big cities. So that's our context for what Benjamin was doing in his very first labor contract. And this is something that no one has ever known before about Benjamin Jarvis. Now, throughout this talk, I do want to talk a little bit more about some of these other people so that we have more context. I don't want these just to be names that float by. Donald McLennan was a real guy. And I think his story is almost more fascinating than the main one that we're telling here. So a different document. So I was trying to figure out more about who he was. There are a lot of Donald McLennans. A bunch of Scottish people came over during the early 19th century to Canada, and they only had like 4 names. So everybody's named Duncan MacDonald and Donald McLennan, and so I was trying to figure out which Donald McLennan is the one that hired Benjamin and what was he doing. This is earlier in the process. But there's a contract, the only other one I found for him, July 19th, 1810, and it doesn't really matter what it was, but it's a protest. This George Myers was complaining that McLennan had failed to pay a debt that he owed. And he confronted him at a restaurant, and McLennan still failed to pay. So for our purposes, this is the most explicit place where we find out that Donald McLennan is a timber merchant from Glengarry. So that helped, seal my interpretation of what was going on. And the date is significant. So the very next day, Donald McLennan fled Montreal with a number of other, with 4 other Scott Canadians, including people with names you might recognize, like Alexander Ross, who becomes important in the fur trade in the Red River Colony. So he went to join John Jacob Astor's expedition to the Columbia River. So I think what's happening is George Myers is like, he's here, He's at this restaurant. I know he's leaving town, and I got to get him to pay his money before he disappears to the other side of the planet. So he boarded this ship Tonquin and went all the way around the tip of South America, shows up at the Columbia River. In 1813, McLennan was released from his contract, and instead of joining the Northwest Company and moving back into Canada, he joined up with the Russians, went across the ocean, and ended up becoming a wealthy sugar planter on the island of Java in Indonesia. And you can be pretty sure he never paid that debt back in Canada. So this was an era where people were on the move. So Benjamin's not the only one who's on the move here. Now, I found no records between 1810 and 1813 for Benjamin in this time period. Can somebody tell me what happened in this time period? The War of 1812 starts. So maybe he kept working at the Bay of Quinte as in the lumber industry. He might have just gone back to help on the farm. In the meantime, there's war between the United States and Great Britain. So I want you to think back to what J. Fletcher Williams had said. Now, J. Fletcher Williams had his birthday wrong, and all the dates after that are wrong about the same amount. So Williams said Benjamin had gone west in 1803 and settled on a farm in 1812, and those things they're simply impossible for someone who was a child and then here. There's no evidence he went west in 1812. Instead, we know that he served in the War of 1812. So here's my sort of route into finding these records. In 1875, Canada finally created a pension for veterans of the War of 1812. There were only 10% of these people still alive. I mean, they were all in their 80s at this point. And it was $20 for any veteran who could prove his service and who still lived in Canada. Now, 5 people in Minnesota applied, including Benjamin, 5 men in Minnesota. Obviously, what they had heard about this it missed the part about you had to still live there, or maybe they were just hopeful. So Ben applied, and this is a published source. So that's how I originally found it. So Benjamin Jarvis, 88, in Little Canada, Minnesota, was a private in the 4th Battalion Embodied Militia, and he didn't get his $20 because he lived in the enemy territory. This is years and years later, and it's right before Benjamin died. So then I went through the muster rolls, and it's really clunky. The website of the National Archive, the Library and Archives Nationale Canada, this particular record source is really clunky to use. So it took a long time, page by page, to actually find him. But he's there. And to explain his service, a little context again, all male British subjects between 16 and 60 were automatically in the militia. But that didn't mean they were doing anything active. So then at times of need, they would hold drafts, local or regional drafts, in which they would embody the militia and actually bring a unit into existence. So Benjamin did serve in the 4th Battalion Select Embodied Militia from February 1814 through March 1815. So a bunch of guys had joined up, their terms ended, and they had a new draft, and he was in sort of the later part of the war. His unit was stationed defensively at Montreal and Lachine, which is the southwest corner of the island of Montreal, and then south of there on the River Chateauguay. They didn't see any action. The major parts of the war were basically over. But that doesn't mean it was a walk in the park for him. And I've got a quote here that I'm just going to read. It's not on screen. From the book, The Canadian Militia, A History of the Origin and Development of the Force. And this is Lieutenant Colonel Voyer, commanding the 4th Battalion Select and Embodied Militia, wrote from his regimental headquarters at Chateauguay to the military secretary on September 26, 1814. So this is while Benjamin was serving in this unit. And he complained that upwards of 500 men of his battalion had not been supplied with any clothing or shoes since June 1813, and a great many of the men had no other but linen trousers, and linen's not going to do it in winter. So there's not anything too remarkable about his service. I've just pulled one of them here, where it was at the top, and you can sort of see Benjamin Jarvis. He's here from the 25th of February to the 24th of March. So for 28 days, the amount he got paid, and any remarks. So here's someone who was sick in quarters. There wasn't too much interesting in those remarks. 1 month Benjamin was on guard duty. 1 month he was sick in the hospital, but it doesn't say from what, and it was obviously pretty minor. So Benjamin served. He served for the British against the United States in the War of 1812, and then later moved to the United States. By the time he moved here, of course, everything had changed. I think about how quickly our alliance with Germany shifted after World War II. So eventually, Benjamin, years later in 1824, he received a plot of land for his service from the government. However, the previous year he had given his father the right to sell that land, and I think he probably did. I didn't find an explicit record of that. But if Caxton Township is the same one that I found that still exists, it still hasn't been surveyed, and it's still worthless. So all these guys had got land up in the middle of nowhere, Quebec, that is still the middle of nowhere, Quebec, out in the woods. Maybe they could have turned it into timber, 50 years later, but they weren't thinking like that at the time. So it's probably good he just sold it. So there he is in this record, Benjamin Jarvis, expanding horizons. So 1816, on the 7th of September 1816, he received 22 acres of land in Rivière-du-Loup from his parents. And based on later records of what his parents had, they basically divided their land in half and gave half of it to Ben. So it looks like he's going to settle down and become a farmer just like his dad. And here is an example, just to use this record as an example. So here's Jean-Baptiste Gervais, Françoise Juinot, and I think it is important to note that she signed a lot of these documents. They were a unit, and I suspect that whatever wealth they have probably came through her family, and that's why she's listed on all these joint documents. And then Benjamin at the bottom, they all signed with a mark. So these people are all illiterate. They can't write their own names. And that's not really remarkable about them. That was how most of these French-Canadian farmers were. Now, he didn't hold on to that land for very long. At least it didn't seem like he was going to stay a farmer. So he got that land in September, and in January, he signed a voyageur contract, his first known voyageur contract to go west with the Northwest Company, a 3-year term. And this record got me really excited, too. This is one of the early ones, these voyageur contracts. Where did he stay? Where did he go? Here it is. So Benjamin Gervais, Rivière-du-Loup, and it's mostly just boilerplate. They did a lot of these contracts. So they just plugged in how much he was getting paid, different signatures, and then a mark that he signed it. However, the day before, back in Rivière-du-Loup, so he's in Montreal signing this contract, and the day before his mother died, back in the farm town, back in the village. And I think that threw a wrench in his plans, and he never left. I think there's a missing record that would say he canceled his contract or voided it somehow, because there are multiple pieces of evidence that he never actually went west at this time. So he was in Montreal in 1818, during what should have been his first winter up in somewhere in the far northwest. And then he signed another voyageur contract in 1819 when he should have just been starting his third year of the first contract. And the reason that he stuck around was because he got involved in the estate and inheritance legal rigmarole after his mother's death. So I found this sort of interesting, that after his mother died, his father was still alive, but they went through all of this legal stuff, which is not typical. You think if the husband's still alive, then he's just going to have the whole estate and they'll sort it out when he dies. So the first record that's associated with this was January 1818, and Benjamin's father received land in another part of Quebec called Drummondville from the eldest son, Jean-Baptiste, and he had received that immediately following his mother's death. So here's some sort of land tenureship that had been inherited through the mother alone. And this also, I think, was a place that Jean-Baptiste, the elder Jean-Baptiste, ended up because he, as part of this, will lose his land in Rivière-du-Loup. So in March 1818, Ben's parents' estate was inventoried and sold, and these records are remarkable. But the one thing I want to highlight here is this little note up here talks about who the heirs were for this estate. And it lists them in birth order, all of the children. So if you're a genealogist, this is the sort of document that is like the holy grail, right? Who's in this family? Who's an heir? And you see Jean-Baptiste, Pélagie, Julie, Esther, Pierre, Tarsily, and Louis Jarvis. And who's missing? Ben is missing. He's the only sibling missing. And what happened was that since Jean-Baptiste was his older brother, Jean-Baptiste claimed that he had a right to at least half of the land that Benjamin had been given in 1816, that should have been his land. And I think Benjamin proposed, I don't think any of this was really a battle. I think they just had conversations about it, because Benjamin came back and proposed that instead he would disclaim his part of the rest of the estate, anything that might come of that, keep his land. So what did he say here? So in one of the records, he stated that the inheritance is more onerous than profitable, so I will just keep the land. You guys get whatever comes out of this estate. And some of the other siblings signed off on it. I think it was amicable. I don't think this was a huge battle. But he did then sort of fight to keep his land, which is one of the surprising things, knowing that he fairly soon gives up the land and goes west. The other thing that we learned from this inventory is, I can now picture Benjamin Jarvis on his family's farm as a teenager, and what they were doing. So they inventoried everything they owned. So here's one part of that inventory. It was like, I think, 5 pages of this. So they owned land. They owned 2 arpents by 14 arpents, which is about 23.7 acres. An arpents is a confusing measurement because in some places it's an area, and in some places it's a linear measurement. But these are linear, about 192 English feet. So they had a wooden house, 18 by 12, in poor condition. So they had their whole family piled up in there. They had a barn and a stable in better condition, so maybe some of the kids lived out there. There's more space and better condition. Their total personal property was valued at 1,819 piastres, and let me tell you, figuring out the money in this was complicated. There are things, as we keep going here, that were listed in pounds and shillings. There were things listed in piastres, in francs, in Spanish dollars. So I had one big eureka moment one night where I had finally figured out the exchange conversions for all of those so that I could figure out what was actually the most expensive stuff here. So what did they have? They had 2 beds with a blanket and bed sheets. They had kitchen stuff. I like the fact that we get details like they sat around a red painted table. We know what color the table was that Benjamin sat around now. They had 2 wagons. They had 2 sleighs, a pair of snowshoes. They had, barely enough kitchen utensils to get through a meal. They had typical farming implements. They're running a farm. None of this was too surprising. What was a little bit more surprising was that they had a bunch of spinning and weaving tools. So they had a canvas loom and spinning wheels. The spinning wheels were common. The loom was not. And then they had other accoutrement for doing this. And I think most of what they were doing was with flax, not sheep. They didn't own any sheep. So they were making most of their homespun clothes out of flax. And one of the questions is, who was doing this? So I think the spinning was done by Françoise, and I think the weaving might have been done by Jean-Baptiste. So weaving was a male occupation until right about this time in French Canada. It transitions over to being a female occupation. So it's not really clear who was doing it. I did look up one study of 24 Quebec households in 1827 showed that rural French Canadians produced an average of 8.3 yards per cloth per person per year. So this is definitely an important part of the farm economy that we don't think about. The indoor part of the economy, the stuff you did all winter, was spinning and weaving. Sitting in your little 18 by 12 shanty spinning flax. So here's a picture of sort of what that might have looked like with flax and a little spinning wheel. What else? We know what crops they had. Now this is March, so this is sort of what's left at the end of winter. They had wheat, oat, and barley. They had peas, flaxseed, which makes sense, potatoes, and hay to feed their animals, which included 3 pigs, 2 old cows. They were marked out as old cows, not nice young ones. A heifer, a horse, a mare, 5 hens, and a rooster. So they're scraping by. This is not a big farm. It's pretty early. When you think about even the American, your homestead, your big, Midwestern farm, this is before that era in American history too. So there weren't people in the United States that had a whole lot more. Americans were probably better off than this, but they weren't huge farms yet. So it's really cool to know all of this detail about the house that Benjamin grew up in. But they also had a lot of debt. So Jean-Baptiste and Françoise owed a lot of money. They owed more than their assets were worth, which I think is what precipitated all of this inventory and then the sale. Specifically, they owed this merchant 60 pounds, which is 4/5 of what their stuff was worth. And this $26 for the price of a mare basically put them over. So the mare that was listed on their sheet was not mortgaged. Basically, they were in debt for the animal that they were using. Here's where we see who actually owned the land. It was the Ursuline sisters of 3 Rivers. They're the ones who they owed rent to. I think they were quite a bit behind in paying their church fees. So, at first glance, it seems like they have enough stuff to get by, but when you dig into the debt, they were not doing that great. So then they sold it, and the sale brought back, like they typically do, less than the inventory amount. And Benjamin, though he wasn't part of an heir to the actual estate, whatever happened with it, because he was right, it was more onerous than profitable. He did buy some of the things from his parents. So he bought a pipe, an axe, he bought snowshoes, and he bought a mare. So I don't know what he did with all this stuff. He farmed for at least a year, and here's just an example. This is the section where he buys a mare. So now you can see the amount of work that Caroline did figuring this stuff out on records that aren't that clear, and actually trying to read this and figure out what they mean. There are some terms, like all language, that are used today or that were used in the past that we don't use today. So figuring all those definitions out, I think she did a great job. So finally, in 1819, Benjamin signs a contract with the Hudson's Bay Company. This is another unusual contract. Everything about their life is just a little bit unusual. This is where he signs up. He signs up as a middleman voyageur, which is what you'd expect. He wasn't a skilled voyageur. This is his first time really doing anything voyageur-like, to make the trip to Red River, where he will be free upon arrival. And he wasn't paid for it. So I think what's happening is that Benjamin was exchanging his labor in the canoe for transportation to the Red River colony. So he basically paid his way there and then made sure he was free. He didn't owe the Hudson's Bay Company anything. So here's that contract, and the section over here is where it talks about to go to Riviera Rouge, where he will be free upon libre upon arrival. And then 3 days later, he signs a will, because he is about to leave for the wild country where he could see the end of his days. So it was plenty of voyageurs died in the West, and he recognized that. So who did he give his stuff to? Well, first, I entrust my soul to God. Secondly, I give to the youngest of my brothers, named Pierre Gervais, all of my assets. I hereby name the said Pierre Gervais my executor, And these two things seem to be in conflict with one another, because the youngest of his brothers, his youngest brother was Pierre, but he was 9 years old, so how can he be the executor? The other Pierre was old enough to be the executor, but he wasn't the youngest of Ben's brothers. So I don't know how to sort this out. One of his brothers, Pierre, or both of them, were involved in his will. And here it is, up there. Pierre Gervais, he's giving him the total of his stuff and naming him the executor. There's the executor. So now Benjamin goes off in 1819 to the Red River. So now we got to dive into Genevieve's early life and get her here. One of the big questions I had going into this is, what is this young, marriageable age French-Canadian woman doing in the Red River colony? Right? You think of the fur traders, they went west. Most of them married native women while they were in the west. Benjamin goes to the Red River colony and finds a white lady. There weren't very many of those. So what's he doing? How does she get here? And her story is equally fascinating. I didn't find as much. I don't have estate inventories or anything that cool for her, but still some really interesting documents. So her parents were Jean-Baptiste Laurence, and he was on and off a farmer, a laborer, and he was a voyageur sometimes. And Angélique de Rossier de la Frenière. This is their marriage record, Jean-Baptiste Laurence. Marie-Angélique de Rossier. So most of Genevieve's ancestors had settled northeast of Montreal, between Montreal and the village of Berthier. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but Berthier is how I'm going to call it, what I'm going to say. So they sort of, generation by generation, just moved upriver until they ended up in Berthier, Berthierville. And for context, here is that Louisville. So we're not that far from where Ben was living in his late teens, just up the road. That's maybe 20 miles, 25 miles. So Genevieve was born and baptized on June 28th, 1804. She was 12 years younger than Ben. Ben was actually fairly old when they got married. And here is her baptism record. So Ben was the second oldest. Genevieve was the 9th of 11 children in a nice big Catholic family. If you're going to run a farm, you need a lot of kids. That's true at any era. So there she is. Effectively, though, she was the youngest because 5 of her siblings died as infants or before age 2. So she is, in effect, the youngest surviving child in this family. Now, one of the things that's important for this part of the story is that between that baptism record that I showed you and the 1850 U.S. Census, there are only 2 records that actually name Genevieve in person. So to figure out stuff about her, we have to rely on her brothers, her father, and her mother. Her mother actually has a ton of records. So Genevieve's father, Jean-Baptiste Laurence, was, as I said, he was a farmer. Sometimes he's listed, on Genevieve's baptism record, he's listed as a laborer, not a farmer. And sometimes he was a voyageur. So he had voyageur contracts dated 1796, 1802, twice in 1802, and then twice in 1810. So if you sign a contract in December, this means that the next summer he would have left to go to the Northwest. Again, in May, he left, so this is for the summer of 1802. He gets back and signs another contract to go back in 1803. So where did he go? He went he overwintered at least once in the Northwest. He went to Grand Portage. And the thing to highlight here is that 1802 was the very last year the Northwest Company used Grand Portage. The next year, they moved up to Thunder Bay, to Fort William in Thunder Bay. So Jean-Baptiste Laurence, Genevieve's father, I think took part in the last big rendezvous that actually took place at Grand Portage. So if you go up and visit that, the site up there, and you have a family connection to this family, think about that very last rendezvous that he was a part of. So then he went to Rainy Lake in 1803. He was more talented. So he's a steersman, which you get paid more and it's more responsibility. So he's one of the people that's guiding the canoe and avoiding obstacles in the river, rocks, and running rapids and stuff. He's not just power. So he was fairly skilled as a voyageur. And this December 1810, he signed up to go to Fort William or Rainy Lake via Michilimackinac again. And this time his son Benjamin, so Genevieve's older brother Benjamin, signed up as a middleman on the same date to go to the same places. So I think they were going off together as a team. Father was going to show the son the ropes of voyageuring, and that's the last record we have of Jean-Baptiste. I think that this suggests, there's no burial record for him in Berthier, and what I think this suggests is that he died out west. There's one record years later of a Benjamin that might be the same, but this Benjamin doesn't show up in any of the other family records either. So I think they maybe capsized on Lake Superior and drowned. You think all these guys are out canoeing? Most of them couldn't swim. So that wasn't a required skill. They actually, some of the people who hired voyageurs thought it was better if their voyageurs didn't know how to swim, because it meant they would try to save the canoe with everything they had. So Jean-Baptiste, so Genevieve's father, died when she was about 6. And just for some geography, if people don't have a clear idea of sort of what we're talking about, so here's Grand Portage, Lake Superior, Duluth would be here now. Grand Portage is right up here on the Pigeon River, and they just shifted the fort up to Fort William, and there's an alternate canoe route that comes together here by Rainy Lake. So they would canoe these routes up to Rainy Lake, and you'll see that this is on the direct route to get up to the Red River, Lake Winnipeg, and here's Fort Garry. We're going to talk quite a bit about Fort Garry and where that is. It's right at the intersection of the Assiniboine River, where the Assiniboine River joins the Red and turns north to Lake Winnipeg. So they paddled all of these rivers and on Lake Superior, on the Great Lakes. Here are just some of those records where you can see Jean-Baptiste Laurence from Berthier, and this is the last one, Jean-Baptiste Laurence, and then Benjamin Laurence, both signed up the same contract. So again, we don't know that much about Genevieve, but we can track her brothers. So Basile Laurence, her brother, engaged as an overwinterer, a hivernant, with the Northwest Company in 1815. So again, he's a teenager. He signs a contract. Again, I think we have a voided contract or he just went 1 year and came back for whatever reason. In 1816, he signed another contract, this time with the Hudson's Bay Company. So one of the things that was happening at this time period is that there was a lot of conflict between the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company. It actually erupted into open battle in the 18-teens, in 1815, in 1816, out in the Red River Colony at Fort William, because this was just direct competition. So I think for the rest of his life, for the rest of his career, Basile worked with the Hudson's Bay Company, and I think this was his switch. I think he switched sides and decided to side with what would ultimately be sort of the more conservative, the establishment, the Hudson's Bay Company. And that 1816 contract is remarkable in a number of ways. Again, we have these unusual things about Ben and Jen. So first of all, it says that he resided at the time at a place called Pointe-à-Calière in Montreal, and not in Berthier. And then I think they moved as a family after Jean-Baptiste's death. They moved as a family to Montreal. So he's going to overwinter in the wild country, specifically in the Hudson Bay territory. He's going to be paid 800 livres in the first year. And he was a spendy guy. I think he was a little bit of a... he was showy. He wanted to show off. So he had a lot of fun things. And we can picture what he looked like, because he had a silk handkerchief, a cotton handkerchief, and this is just some of the things that were in his initial contract. We'll talk about some of the other stuff he bought. He burned through this 800 livres very quickly, buying fancy stuff. The other thing that's really interesting is that Angélique Lafrenière, so his mother, intervenes in this contract. She is mentioned, she's named as a guarantor of his work. So not only is he going to be mortgaging all of his possessions, actual and future, but now she is on the hook too for his work to go west. But she needs support in this time period. So her son is going out west to earn money. And here's, again, just a lot of French. But this section that I've got quoted here, so Angélique Lafrenière, and this is just in a voyageur contract. You don't expect to find this kind of thing in what is really a standardized contract for voyageuring. So as I said, he was a colorful voyageur. He spent well over his 800 livres on supplies, including non-necessities such as English shoes. He really could get by with Indian shoes, with moccasins, or beef shoes as they were sometimes called. He bought colored thread. He bought China silk handkerchiefs, a foxtail feather, whatever that is. A foxtail, I assume, he stuck on his hat. He bought a quart of high wine, lots of tobacco. Everybody smoked tobacco. That was standard, but he bought a lot of it, and he also bought himself some wine. And he even bought dogs from one of the Hudson Bay Company officers at the Red River. I don't know how you'd have dogs and be on the move like that, but he also returned a favor to his mother. So one of the account books at the Red River Colony, so I looked through the Hudson Bay Company account books on microfilm. You can only get 3 at a time. They sent him down from Manitoba. But he advanced money to his mother. So here's where I learned all of this stuff about what he bought. So he gets to the Red River Colony. So this is at Fort Garry, or Fort Douglas, as it was called in early years. And here's where it says, he bought tobacco, trousers, a knife. Here are his English shoes. Some of this stuff is just a necessity, right? You need shirts and basic stuff. He's got a soap and razors. But then as you go, you see he's buying colored thread and his foxtail feather and the quart of high wine. And you can sort of get a sense of here are the necessities, and by the bottom, not so. Here's some luxuries. And then he advanced to his mother some money. And this is, again, further evidence. In that previous contract, she was listed as a widow, so we know that Jean-Baptiste is definitely dead by this point, and that she's being supported by Basil's work in the Red River Colony, and she still lives in Montreal. But then you see the total that he spent 1,100 livres of his 800. That's not good. So he's definitely in debt for his next year's worth of work. And then the other thing to note here is, so this stuff is, again, it applies to him. It's stuff that he bought. They crossed it off because they rewrote it in a different account book, and so they didn't want it to be accounted for here. But it says where he was stationed, so where he made these purchases, which is Fort Douglas and Pembina, North Dakota. So I just want to highlight one other record. So as I was looking through these in the index, there's another one here that had been crossed off. If you see up top, Genevieve Laurence, and it's crossed off and moved to a different book. But the next guy listed on the same page is someone named Joseph Gobin. So if you are a descendant of Alphonse or Basil Jarvis, so Ben and Jen's children, both of them married daughters of Joseph Gobin. So he's out here. He's living in the West too. And if you zoom in, you see the stuff that he bought. And one of the cool things is at the very bottom, he bought a gun, which in a separate pen, in a separate note, was lost when attacked by the natives. So it was dangerous. You could drown. There was violence. There was conflict between the companies. You could be out trading and have, these native groups, native tribes were also competing with one another for access to these trade goods. And if you ended up on, you're trading too much with one tribe, another tribe would happily attack you to get either to scare you away, to convince you to come to another place. So there's all sorts of cool stuff that you can dig up in those Hudson Bay Company records. I barely scratched the surface. I focused on the Red River Colony. I didn't pan out at all to Fort William or anywhere else that they might have been stationed. So his voyageur career, in 1818, he was transferred way into the Northwest, the Peace River District. His career was long enough that it's been summarized by the company. So they took some of their most intrepid voyageurs and have produced these biographical sheets. So this you can access just online. Just search up Hudson Bay Company biographical sheets and you'll see some of these. For the people who were really active, it's far from everyone. But you can see where he was stationed. So the Peace River District, he got moved to Peace River in 1818. He ends up at Fort Chipewyan in the Athabasca District. For a lot of years, he was in the Saskatchewan District, and at some point, he did cross the Rockies into the Columbia. And finally, he retired to the Red River settlement in 1847. So that's a lot of great information that doesn't have you going to dig in all of these. I mean, it's got the citations. You would have to look at all of these individual records to piece this together yourself. So it's great to have something like this that summarizes it. So where is that? So here's Montreal. Here's the Red River. And it doesn't look so far on this map when you consider that he went up to the Peace River District, Athabasca, in nearly the subarctic to be a voyageur. Now another brother, Charles Laurence, in 1816. So as they reached age 17, they all signed up to go west. So he was hired by an independent merchant, Henry Forrest. In 1817, he was hired again by Forrest to go west. In 1818, he's hired again to go west to Fort William. And finally, in 1819, he's hired to go to the Red River. So again, these contracts, though it's not explicit, he's contributing. He's supporting their mother. And here is the one that he sends him to the Red River, Riviera Rouge. Now, a little bit of context for the Red River settlement, again, for people who don't really know the Red River settlement and how people ended up there. So Thomas Douglas, Earl of Selkirk, envisioned an agricultural colony out here on the Canadian prairie, the Red River, flat. It's good farmland as long as you stay in the river valley, to serve as a landing spot for Scottish refugees. So he was Scottish, he had a lot of money, but he felt bad for all the Scots who were being evicted from their land. The English were pretty ruthless. A similar thing happened in Ireland, 40 years later, with Irish people not just being in famine, but being kicked off the land because it was more profitable to have sheep than to have tenant farmers. So it also worked out. He bought out the majority share in the Hudson Bay Company and envisioned that his colony would supply the company with produce made on the farms out in the West instead of having to ship stuff from England through Hudson Bay to supply all the voyageurs for the Hudson Bay Company. So the first settlers arrived in 1812, and he very quickly moved to I will take anyone who will come live out in the middle of nowhere. Please, anyone. So within a decade, it had Scots, Swiss, Poles, retired German mercenaries, people from the Orkney Islands. It was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious place. And then there was a separate Métis settlement. So Métis were the children, basically, of French voyageurs and traders and native women. And by this point, around 1800, there were enough of them that they started forming their own communities. And the biggest one was near Pembina. So it sort of stretched along the Red River here between Winnipeg and Pembina. You've got a whole bunch of different people with different purposes for being there. You have two companies at odds with each other who are clashing right over this particular place because this is a Hudson Bay Company colony right in the path of the Northwest Company fur trade routes. So throughout the 1810s, as I mentioned already, it was violent. Lord Selkirk himself raised an army and started heading west in 1817 after the governor of the colony had been killed in battle in 1816. Honestly, I'm pretty thankful Benjamin wasn't out here yet because that was more opportunity to be killed. So he didn't come until 1819. And one of the records, actually, Basil Laurence claimed he traveled with Lord Selkirk on that 1817 journey west. Here's the settlement as it was outlined, this land grant, a huge grant of land from Lake Winnipeg all the way south to the height of land. It doesn't match a modern map. This is a little bit straighter, actually, but this is down by Big Stone County, Minnesota, Lake Traverse. So all of this, here's the forts at the confluence. Here's Fort Douglas at the confluence up here. This is Pembina. So this is your little stretch of land here. There's a lot going on. And the Métis population, their economy was based on pemmican. So they would go off into the Dakotas and hunt bison, bring it back, process it into pemmican, and sell it to all the fur traders as food. And it was great food, high energy, tightly packed, tasted awful. But that was their economy. So some of the conflict started when the colony governor, in order to feed all of his starving colonists who could not grow enough food for themselves right off the bat, ordered that all the pemmican had to stay within the colony to feed the colonists, and that killed their market, their broader market, and led to some conflict. So now, okay, we've got Genevieve's brothers are in the West. They're supporting their mother. How does Genevieve get there? Well, on May 22nd, 1818, Angélique Lafrenière engaged herself. She signed up herself as a colonist. So a very independent woman. She wished to establish herself as a habitant or settler at the Red River. So she was 49, and she also brought with her family, consisting of 2 daughters. So we know that these are her youngest 2 daughters, Julie and Genevieve, who were teenagers. So you picture a single, woman and 2 teenage girls getting in a canoe and going across country to farm. And again, more crazy details here. And as I said, I mean, Lord Selkirk was desperate for colonists. So taking a widow and 2 teenage girls was, they were warm bodies, who were willing to go out, who were willing to go west. So we know the people that they went with in these canoes. So many of the people who signed up were colonists, but also a blacksmith, loggers and sawyers, carpenters, a wheelwright. He's trying to get people with skills to come out as well to boost the colony. And this is the record. This is one of the coolest records, I think. It's the engagement of Angélique Lafrenière and her family with the Count of Selkirk. And now, so this is another record that will now be here at the Little Canada Historical Society. So the voyage, we know they traveled in the first canoe. I mean, the amount of detail that we know about a trip in 1818 is just crazy. So this is in the Selkirk papers. Lord Selkirk received an account of the voyage because they had to keep track of which people and which goods were in which canoe in case a canoe got lost. So they departed Montreal on June 15th, and 72 days later, or 10 weeks and 2 days later, they arrived at the Red River. And the person who had signed them up and who traveled with them, the agent who was responsible for their care, wrote in that account that everyone was in good health, but they were hungry since one batch of the pemmican had turned out to be spoiled, so they had to go on lower rations for part of the trip. And when they got to the Red River colony, they discovered that all the crops except for wheat had recently been destroyed by grasshoppers, 3 inches thick on the ground. So Mathey planned to send, he says, the women and children to Pembina for food. So they went to Pembina. There's another account that says that the settlers actually demanded that they be sent to Pembina so that they could eat. So here's this part of this record here. And we're 5,000 pages into the Selkirk papers, but it says a list of the canoes, I'm not sure what that is, but I think goods and passengers of the 7 canoes intended for the Red River settlement. Here's Mrs. Laurence and her 2 daughters who are going as settlers. And the next page lists sort of the total breakdown of who's going. So there are 11 male settlers, 20 female settlers, 12 boys and 6 girls. and then a list of all the goods that went in each canoe. So the stuff they're bringing, window glass and sheet iron, and the amount of detail is just astonishing. When I started this project, I never thought that I'd have this level of detail about about these people. So, as I already mentioned, they got there 1818. There had been grasshoppers. A cloud of grasshoppers fell like snow, was one of the reports from 1818. In 1819, here's the Bishop Provencher, the first religious people to go west, the first Catholics to go west came in 1818. Provencher, they were about a week behind. Angelique Lafreniere was about a week behind the religious folks. And he writes that the grasshoppers have completely destroyed everything. Thus we shall not have bread to eat and shall have difficulty getting seed for next year. And in the same letter, he writes that there are very few animals in the colony. So they're desperate for animals. Around this time, I think it was 1821, they sent, in the middle of winter, some folks from the Red River to Prairie du Chien, so through Indian country all the way to Prairie du Chien, to bring back cattle because they were desperate for animals that people could eat. So there's very little here. Among all the people in the colony, there are 60 hogs and 3 cows. And at the same time, whooping cough and measles have reigned here and have taken a number of children. This is 1819. We never hear of Julie again after that. We know that she arrived safely because Mathey reports that everybody made it, but there's no record of her. So she might have gotten married, and there's just not a record because now she's under a different name, or she might have been taken by any number of challenges in the Red River colony because it was really tough. So here are a couple letters from a man named Laurent La Police, who was from Rivière-du-Loup. And he writes that I'm happy, he's writing to his wife, I'm happy you did not accompany me here because we had to endure many miseries. We spent 25 days without food and had to travel the last stretch on the ice. So they were delayed. I know we didn't die because of all the unwanted fasting, but we were close enough. And I would come get you in a heartbeat if I knew you would be happy living here, but this country is too harsh for you or our children. I'd rather stay here a couple years and earn enough to go back to get you. You can expect me in 2 years from now. I'm going to hope to see you again, your husband. So to picture, these people coming out here, women and children coming out here with very little, they have no money, they're trying to support themselves. And, at least some of Genevieve's brothers were out in the West helping to support them. But it was a tough life. And indeed, Laurent La Police died in 1822 and never did see his family. And we'll see how I came across that record a little bit later. So the widow farmer, Angelique, set up a tiny little farm north of Fort Garry and relied there continuously for years. And Genevieve grew to adulthood on that little farm. We'll talk more about this in a minute. But now to focus on Benjamin. So Benjamin gets here. It's 1819. What's he doing? We know that record where we left off. He's announced himself as an independent person in the West. He's not tied to any of the companies. He's an independent trader. So this is, he didn't probably fly a British flag, but he was an independent guy. I think he had probably an express canoe that he used in his business, similar to that. So if we go back to J. Fletcher Williams again, it says Jarvis did not himself settle there that year, but made trading voyages back and forth to Canada until the year 1812. So I think that the dates should be updated to say that he did not settle there in 1819, but made trading voyages back and forth to Canada until 1824. So that's a little bit of, hey, J. Fletcher Williams did get something right here. We did, this is correct. He made trading voyages back and forth. So what was his life like as an independent trader? And how do we know about it? Well, I found a bunch of legal documents signed at Montreal, as well as a number of chance mentions in different letters from Red River settlers like Laurent La Police that have been published. I haven't found any unpublished secret archive of stuff, just things that have been published and are word searchable on the internet. So the amazing internet. And not Hudson Bay Company records. So I don't have there's no mention of him, at least in the Red River settlement records from Hudson Bay Company in this time period. Only other sources. So it was a seasonal business, and based on all these different records, I was able to piece together sort of when and where Benjamin was moving through all of this. So we know basically, although there's a record that says he could make 2 trips in one season, for the most part, I think he went down in the summer or he went back up in the summer. You saw how long it took to get, if he could go a little faster than canoes loaded with cargo and passengers, but not that much faster. It was still at least about 60 days. So he's in Red River, then he goes to Montreal and back and forth, just like J. Fletcher Williams said. And one of the things that's going on here is he sort of got a jump on this independent trader business. So in 1821, after years of violence, the British government forced the 2 big companies to merge. And what that, like today, consolidation meant layoffs. Instead of having competing forts next to each other, all of a sudden you're one company and half of that staff can be laid off. So some of the released clerks and voyageurs set themselves up as independent traders in the Red River colony. Some of them settled with their native wives and in the Red River settlement, which doubled in population in 1821. So the Hudson Bay Company was still supplied largely through Hudson's Bay, which with the Northwest Company traffic declining now after the merger, there was less traffic going back and forth between Montreal and the Red River colony. And I think that's where Benjamin saw his niche. He's going to be that sort of courier, bringing goods and correspondence back and forth in an express, in a faster canoe. So what do we know? And I'll sort of speed through this. From that letter, one of those letters from Laurent La Police that's been published, he says he left 2 dresses with Benjamin Jarvis, and his wife was a seamstress. So this makes sense. I left 2 dresses with Benjamin Jarvis, who must come down next spring and will take them from me. So this tells us about where he was in 1820. It tells us about where he's going to be in 1821. And it tells us something about what he was transporting in his canoes. The next records are from Montreal. So in August 1821, he signed 2 contracts with a merchant named Jean-Dominique Bernard. And you'll get to know this name. He had a pretty solid relationship with Bernard. He borrowed merchandise valued at £55 and agreed to pay back the debt at no interest. So Bernard was giving him a deal here, a no interest loan on this stuff, on the 1st of November in 1 year. So 18 months, or 14 months, I think 14, 15 months, no interest loan on these goods. Now, the contract called Benjamin a farmer, so he was still sort of pretending to be a farmer at Rivière de Loup in 1821. But then it says he's actually a voyageur from the Red River. So he wasn't sure what he was doing. That's how I read that, is he was still trying to do both, and obviously you couldn't do both on a schedule like this. So in 1822, we have a record quoted in a later legal document that records a transaction he conducted at Pembina. So we know he's not just conducting at the Red River colony, he's down in that Métis community. So it says, this is one, thankfully is in English, at 30 days' sight, please pay to Benjamin Jarvis, or order the sum of £42, 15 shillings and 4 pence, Halifax currency, your most obedient and humble servant, Grant Forrest. We already encountered the Forrests. Charles Laurence had signed some contracts with Henry Forrest, and Grant Forrest is Henry's son, an agent in the West. So in 1823, Benjamin is in Montreal, and this is when he gives up his land. He tells his dad, you know what, I'm going to do this voyageur thing full time. This is my life. And he sells his land. He gives his father authority to sell his land and to sell whatever he might receive from the upcoming War of 1812, land distribution in 1824, and now he's given his residence as Montreal. So he's full-time moved to Montreal. He's selling his land to become an independent trader. And a few days later, he purchased property in the suburb of Saint Laurent, which is now basically the heart of downtown Montreal, for 3,000 livres. Old money is about 125 pounds, and he bought that from Jean-Baptiste Dupuis de la France through his Montreal agent Jean-Dominique Bernard. And again, I want to sort of point out who these people are. They're not just names on a page. Jean-Baptiste Dupuy de la France was a long-time Northwest Company trader in the Northwest. He's perhaps most famous for being one of the Canadian traders that Lewis and Clark encountered in the Mandan villages in 1804. So he'd been out there for a long time, and I think Benjamin had an ongoing relationship with La France and Bernard. So they're, to run a business like that, Bernard's running the finances in Montreal and the goods coming from Europe. La France is in the West, distributing those, getting the furs or whatever else, and sending them back to Montreal. And Benjamin is hired to be their transportation. So he bought this land I think to maybe set up his own little office. So he bought it from the people he already had business relationships with, a 40 by 90 foot lot on St. Elizabeth Street with a little wooden house and other buildings on it. And this is just focus on Michael Sanders is one of the people who lives nearby and actually backs up. And at this time, his residence is given as Pointe-à-Calière, just as Basil Laurence's residence had been. So here is a map from 1825 of Montreal. So this is Pointe-à-Calière. This is where Montreal had been founded, centuries earlier. This is the part of Montreal, the oldest part of the city. This is the place where Jean-Dominique Bernard had an office. So this is sort of the riverfront business district. And out here in the suburbs, is where Benjamin bought his plot of land. Maybe he meant it as a residence. Maybe it was going to be home base for his business. I'm not sure. If we zoom in, based on the amount of detail in the contract, it's on St. Elizabeth Street. There's another record that mentions St. Catherine Street, which is this one. So having a house and a couple buildings, I think it's this one right here that literally identified where he lived in Montreal. And if it's not this, it's somewhere right here on this corner. Then he writes another will. So this one, I can't make heads or tails of. He named as his executrix and heir Marie Anne Roseau, a 57-year-old widow, whom Ben identified as his friend. There's nothing internal in the document that says anything. I did a little research on her. Her husband Alexander had died a few years earlier. She might. I couldn't find anything. We're a few years too early for city directories for the city of Montreal. I thought maybe she was running a boarding house, and she gave him a good rate or something, and he appreciated it. And I mean that literally, because she's fairly old here. He's He's 30. So Ben is 30, 31 at this point, and here's a 57-year-old widow. I don't know. I'm just going to leave that there because I don't know what to make of it. But at this point, if he dies, all his stuff's going to her. This is April 1823, which is like 6 months before J. Fletcher Williams says he marries Genevieve. So back in the fall here, August 1823, so over the summer, he's gone back to the Red River settlement, and he appears, this is in the Red River settlement here again, there aren't any regular records, so he appears in the financial list, the financial log of the American Army explorer Stephen H. Long, who was sent up in 1823 to explore the Red River colony to establish the 49th parallel boundary. So when he's there, they lived a little bit off the land and off the people that were there. So he bought from Benjamin Jarvis a North canoe and a Voyageur's kettle. And this is the other document that I mentioned that is here. So this is the document that I first encountered here. You can see this online as well. It's for $59. And we learned that he discarded Benjamin's canoe at Fort William, and the kettle was dispensed in the service. So this is a copy of what's here at the Little Canada Historical Society, a page out of a book that published, Stephen H. Long's journal, an account book. So at least we know where Benjamin was, and we know here he's selling a canoe. So one of the things that raised for me is he giving up this voyageur business already? It's been 6 months since he decided he was going to do it for good, and is he giving it up? No, I think he went for one more year, and then I'm not sure what happens. So in 1824, the bishop, now the bishop Norbert Provencher, who I mentioned before, wrote a letter to the more important bishop in Quebec, and it includes the name Benjamin Jarvis. And it says that a man by the name of Benjamin Jarvis, one of our settlers and a native of Rivière-du-Loup, will be the bearer of this letter, and will even be able to afford your lordship the means of honoring me with a reply this year, so that we know that Benjamin's going down and back in 1 year, I think for the first time. Yada, yada, yada. But he does think Jarvis is going to stop in Montreal as well. So he's going to go visit his family in Rivière-du-Loup. He's going to go stop in Montreal. And he does indeed in August stop in Montreal. And to me, what it looks like at the end of here in August of 1824 is he's wrapping up his business. So to go back to that, the first record is he files a protest against Henry Forrest. We've encountered this Forrest family, these traders, for a failure to pay up on that exchange, the bill of exchange from 1822 at Pembina. The next day, he got money from a man named Michel Menard de Brindamore, who was acting now as an agent of Jean-Baptiste Dupuy de la France again. We've encountered him before. So he's being paid, and what's he being paid for? Well, the next day, he receives from Brindamore 8 legal documents belonging to La France, and Ben promises to deliver the documents to the said Jean-Baptiste Dupuy de la France at Pembina. So this is the clearest evidence. I think there's a lot of missing records, but this is the clearest evidence of what exactly Benjamin's business was. So he's getting paid to transport records, and primarily for this guy named Jean-Baptiste Dupuy de la France and his connections back in Montreal. And I want to point out again, who are these people? So Michel Menard de Brindamore had several famous relatives. So his older brother Pierre, born in 1766, became a trader and businessman in Illinois and was actually the first lieutenant governor of Illinois. And his son, Michel, so another Michel Brindamore, began as a trader in Detroit, came to Minnesota as a trader, and then followed the Shawnee trade to Texas, where he founded Galveston, Texas. So Benjamin's not the only the only French Canadian who's involved in these businesses, who ends up out west and sort of accidentally founds some cities. And again, so Ben's residence is still listed as Montreal, as Pointe-à-Calière, and that raises some questions about when exactly he got married. So Benjamin Jarvis, Voyageur, Pointe-à-Calière, and there's Jean-Baptiste Dupuy de la France at Pembina. Is that the same one? Yeah, 8 legal documents. He's delivering them on August 30th. So pretty much every day here, he's doing business, and we have a record of it. So August 30th, he sells his land that he just bought the year before in St. Laurent to Michael, in this case, Michael Sanders, but it's the same guy. It's Michael Sanders, a general merchant of diverse things who owned the lot behind Benjamin. Now, he sold it for 2,000 livres. He'd bought it for 3,000. So this is not a good business transaction, to say the least, 33% in 1 year. But he received, as part of the deal, explicitly 600 francs cash. So I think he's trying to cash out. He's trying to call in his debts. He's selling his land at a loss, but he needs cash. He's going to go move to Red River permanently, and he wants as much cash in hand as possible. So I'll try to get us through the rest here before noon. So he moves finally to the Red River colony. The first record is 1824, an index to the plan of the Red River settlement. For the first time, somebody went and surveyed the lots and who had them at the Red River settlement. So this is our first look at the farm that Angelique Laurence was running as an independent woman in the Red River settlement. Benjamin's not listed. That makes sense. He still was living in Montreal and doing his trading. So she's 55. She's a Roman Catholic born in Canada. She has 4 acres of land that she has most of it under cultivation. Her son, Jean-Baptiste Laurence, is living right next door. So I never found how he got west or when, but he's here. He's living right next door. So it's good to have that many sons who could help support her. And Genevieve is presumably just living there. She's 20 at this point. So when did Benjamin and Genevieve marry? The only record that we have is J. Fletcher Williams, and it says September 29th, 1823. Did it happen at that time? There's some evidence in favor, and the evidence in favor is Stephen H. Long says he's here in August 1823, so it makes sense he's still there in September. And their first child, Alphonse, records suggest was born about 1824. That would also make sense. I also think it's plausible that they oops and had a kid and later got married. That Alphonse is this sort of island. He's born, and then there are no other children until 1829. So they might have died young, but Benjamin was still doing this trading. It's not clear. I don't see a good reason not to go with 1823. He might have gotten married and decided in 1824, I'm going to close down all my businesses and come back permanently. Then he disappears. So there are no records of him between 1824 and 1829 that I could find. I think if I went through all the Hudson Bay Company records all over the Northwest, I could find him. But I didn't do that this summer while I was doing this project. So the best that we've got is, I think he's in the employ of the Hudson's Bay Company, as J. Fletcher Williams says, but at least he's based out west. So then what happens? We already heard about all the grasshoppers and how hard it is to live out here. In 1826, the worst flood the Red River has ever seen happened. A scene of devastation dreadful to contemplate. The ice broke up, and most of you know the Red River flows north, and that's not helpful for flooding because the ice to the south melts and runs into a blocked river to the north. So the ice crashed as loud as thunder, mowing down trees like grass before the scythe. And all the inhabitants in the entire colony fled their dwellings. They went as far, they were stranded on hilltops 17 miles apart. So the ones on the east side just ran east, the ones on the west fled west, and they ended up, for the first place that was safe from this flood was 2.17 miles apart. So the water rose until the beginning of June and then fell until the early part of July. So for 2 months, these people are all homeless and they cannot plant anything for food. And this was enough for some of the settlers to just leave. A lot of the Swiss settlers after 1826 abandoned ship and went south. Abraham Perry was one of them. He ended up settling outside Fort Snelling. Some of them went as far as St. Louis. So they gave up. The Gervaises and Laurences stuck it out. So this is 40% higher than the flood of 1997, and without the aid of all of our dikes and stuff that help raise the level to keep it from spreading. This is a picture, a Google image of the place, and I'll show you on a map in a few slides where this is exactly, of the land that Angelique Laurence was farming. And as you can see, it's right next to the river, and it's very flat. So consequences of the flood. Well, some settlers gave up and headed south. As I mentioned, Abraham Perry. Others went south to Illinois and Missouri. And the Hudson Bay Company looked at this still struggling colony. Here we are 14 years after founding, and this thing, people are fleeing. It's not producing anywhere near enough to support itself, much less to supply the company. So they began to take an annual census. And how many of you, if you do genealogy, we rely so much on the 10-year censuses that we have in the United States. And here we are, we get from 1827 to 1833 annual censuses of the Red River Colony, including, and these are the years when Benjamin and Genevieve lived there. So I won't go through all of them, but I'll highlight at least sort of what they look like and what we learned from them. So the very first one, 1827, here's the widow Laurence. And I'll go back here to actually summarize it. So it says what lot she has. She's 65. And this is one of the curious things that I want to call out. So she's a woman. She has a daughter above 15 and a son under 16. Now, these categories aren't perfect. It's not like you could freehand write who they were. A female above 15 and a male under 16. I think this is Genevieve and Alphonse. So I think that they're still living with her. Alphonse was born around 1824, and Benjamin's not listed in the 1827 Red River Census. I said he's missing. I don't know where he is, but this supports the idea that he's off earning money independently, and that she, Genevieve, is at home with a 2 or 3-year-old and her mother. And we see that, again, really limited farming. They have 3 cows and 5 acres under cultivation. And Charles and Baptiste Laurence had small lots in the settlement. They didn't live nearby, but close enough to support. In 1828, again, there's a daughter above 15 and a son under 16, who I think is still Alphonse. One of her sons had moved in with her, or some sort of farmhand. And Charles had moved closer. There they are, Widow Laurence and Charles Laurence. In 1829, this is the first time that we see Benjamin. So this, I think, is the year that he finally actually settled down to become a farmer in the Red River Colony. He's listed as 40 years old. He's born in Canada. And finally, we see the same woman and a son under 16. So it's still just one at each point. And this is, Angelique is listed without children at this point. So it fits perfectly that they're moving in with, Genevieve moves in with her husband and out from her mother. And this is the last census where they're listed sort of in order that you would walk farm to farm. The next year they start being listed alphabetically, and they're listed right next to each other. So Benjamin bought land right next to, or received land, I should say, right next to Angelique. And again, they have very little, 8 acres total, a few animals, and they even divided the animals. So in 1828, she had 5 cows. In 1829, together they have 5 cows. And there they are, Benjamin Jarvis and Angelique Laurence. The next record is from 1829, October. Benjamin and Genevieve were present at the baptism of their son, Sever. And the name has always raised questions. It possibly was about her labor and delivery. That's the best conclusion that I've got. But Benjamin's listed as a farmer, and these records, most of these church records, do not survive. The Church of St. Boniface has burned multiple times in its history. These are somebody abstracted most of the records. They didn't do a great job. We know there are some missing ones, but they've been consolidated into note cards from that abstraction, and we see sort of what the notes are. So Gervais Sever, son of Benjamin Jarvis, a farmer, and Genevieve Laurence. Too fast here. Then Benjamin disappears again. He's absent for 3 more censuses, and I don't know where he went or what he was doing. So in 1830, there are no children living with Angelique. In 1831, she's got a son again living with her, some sort of grandson, presumably. And I think Alphonse at this point was possibly just raised by his grandmother, and not by his parents. I don't know where Genevieve is either. This might be when Benjamin went to check out Fort Snelling. J. Fletcher Williams says he went down to check out Fort Snelling in 1827. That's possible. So in 1832, even though he's not listed in the census, he's present as a godfather at the baptism of a friend. This Nault family is a friend. In 1833, Benjamin Jarvis is finally back again, and now he has 3 sons under 16. So Sever, Isaiah probably by this point, and in 1834, and you'll also notice that they finally have a little bit more under cultivation, 18 acres. They're doing a little bit better. In 1835, 4 sons under 16. So that now they're really going. That's a good Catholic family. Fortunately, as far as being farmers, they're having a lot of sons. And J. Fletcher Williams actually notes that when they came down in 1838, that they had a lot of sons to help them build stuff. And and Angelique Laurence is here. By my calculation, doing the genealogy, by 1835, they actually had 5 sons. Benjamin Jr. was born in 1835. And so this could be the 4 younger sons, and this could still be Alphonse living with his grandmother. So that's my hypothesis. There's no way to prove it, but so here we're going to see actually where this land is. So in 1836, they conducted a formal property survey. They renumbered the lots. They mapped everything. They in 1835 and 36, they questioned all the settlers to figure out how did these people get the land. They're trying to get some control on deeds and buying and selling, and figuring out a way to tax them. So this tells us that Benjamin had been on the land for 6 years, which is about 1829, 1830, and Angelique had been there for 18, which matches coming in 1818. The property notes say they're on Point Douglas, and so we know exactly where that is. So here's the map, one of these maps from the 1830s. Technically it's upside down. This is Fort Garry upside down. And those lots are right here, right in the point of Fort Douglas, or of Point Douglas. So you can, if you want to go to Winnipeg, you can now go visit Point Douglas and check it out. And it says, so the most interesting thing about these sale memoranda are that Benjamin received his 3 acres by grant from the Earl of Selkirk. Or from his heirs, because the Earl of Selkirk died before Benjamin actually got to the west. And Madame Laurence also had her land granted by the Earl of Selkirk. That made it not easy for the company to tax them. And then the other record is that there's a note on the side of a later record that says this land was transferred to André Goudry in 1839, and that matches when she disappears from the census records. So she finally died in 1838 or 39. Out here in the middle of, the Red River colony, far, far away from Quebec. And here is the only mention as well of Pierre Jarvis. So Pierre, very briefly, Benjamin's brother, lived in the Red River colony and says that his land was also granted by the Earl of Selkirk. So Pierre shows up, he's there very briefly, he goes down to Fort Snelling and works for the American Fur Company a couple years before Benjamin moves down here to Minnesota. So here again are those lots on a different map. Here's a modern map of Winnipeg. Downtown Winnipeg is over here. And this is sort of a industrial wasteland at this point. And I'll just skip this. This is that Pierre Jarvis. So let's get them to Minnesota now. These last few years, we know what they're doing up there. So July 12th, 1838 is the date, I'm very confident this is accurate, that they arrived in the U.S. for good at St. Peter or Mendota. Both declarations of intention give the same date. J. Fletcher Williams then says the very next day they went, Benjamin and Pierre went together to make claims near Fountain Cave in what is now St. Paul. So there's were the 3rd and 4th claims in modern St. Paul after Pig's Eye Perrant and Abraham Perry. So as I mentioned, they began building a new life, new homes, barns, etc. And 2 days later, news arrived at Fort Snelling that the Dakota Treaty of 1837 had been ratified by the U.S. Senate. So that, I think, is the driving factor for why they moved down here. Benjamin had a lot granted by the Earl of Selkirk at the Red River Colony. You don't leave that, even if it's tough, if you have nowhere else to go. In 1837, the treaties with the Ojibwe and Dakota were negotiated. The Ojibwe at Fort Snelling and the Dakota went to Washington, D.C., and that opened up land east of the Mississippi River for settlement. So there was plenty of communication back and forth by this point. What was going on at Fort Snelling, what's going on at Red River. So this is, I think, the big driver that now we can go down here. It's legal for us to settle. It's better land. We can have more land. And as I said, J. Fletcher Williams mentioned 1 or 2 stout boys. So they're children born at Red River. Some of these dates, we don't have a specific baptism. This is what people have come up with that makes sense. I think Benjamin Jr. might have been born in January 11th, 1835. It might have been 1836. Again, Alphonse, if you look at his census records, he's all over the map. The earlier ones say 1824, but he too didn't know how old he was when he died. So now Plimpton. right? We met him early on in the introduction. So he takes over at Fort Snelling in August 1837, and he took a hard line with military discipline. So he did not want alcohol available to the soldiers there. They routinely went across the river, hung out with Pig's Eye Perrant, got drunk, stayed out for several days, and that's not great for military discipline. So he unilaterally expanded and quite illegally expanded the military reserve in 1838. He just decided, I'm going to draw on a map and say that this is now the military reserve without any legislative action. But his goal was to move the liquor dealers like Perrant downriver, get them farther away, and evict all non-military personnel from Camp Coldwater. So here's a map. Here's Fort Snelling and Pike Island. Mendota Fur Trading Post, Henry Sibley, is down here. So this is the original reserve as it was drawn, and this is the line that the settlers like Benjamin Jarvis, when they went to get their land, they were basing it on this pink line. It's a little hard to see with the light in here, but it goes right sort of to the cave. And if you're beyond the cave, you're good. So this is the line as it was originally surveyed and sort of drawn out in by Plimpton, one of Plimpton's assistants. And in 1839, we'll just sort of cover, there'll be consequences of that in a few minutes. So this is a really eventful year. So September 4th, 1839, Benjamin and Genevieve's son, Basile, who's famous for being the first white child born in St. Paul, this is his birth date at the Jarvis's Tamarack Shack just past the cave, just across from Ross Island. The next day is the best conclusion, the best guess for when Sergeant John Hayes died. So Hayes had been a soldier at Fort Snelling and was released along with his buddy and former soldier Edward Phelan. And Phelan is accused of murdering his claimmate John Hayes in order to get all the land, and he's hauled off to Prairie du Chien. And this becomes relevant again. So in October, Plimpton had someone do a formal survey to establish the military boundaries, and it turned out the new map has the line going way past the cave. So all the people who had settled here, thinking they were safe, they were doing the right thing, were now within the boundary, and their houses were illegally placed. So on the 21st of October, on a request from Plimpton, the War Department ordered the U.S. Marshal of Wisconsin Territory to eject the intruders. They didn't actually get the order until February because it had been sent to Iowa. Nobody knew very much about what was out here yet. And in November, the settlers, including Benjamin Jarvis, petitioned the Wisconsin Territorial Legislature to say, hey, this isn't fair. Like, we are doing everything right. Please prevent the expansion of the military reserve. And the Wisconsin Territorial Legislature passed a resolution against it. The Wisconsin Territorial representative at Congress protested to the War Department. I mean, they did everything they could not to be evicted again. Some of these people had, like Perry, had come from Camp Coldwater. They'd been kicked out. They moved, and now they're getting kicked out again 2 years later. But in 1840, the deputy marshal from Prairie du Chien arrived and told everybody to leave. It's like, you have to leave. Get out of your houses and move somewhere. And on the 6th of May, after nobody left, he got soldiers from Fort Snelling and destroyed all of their houses. So they're homeless again. And this is a point where J. Fletcher Williams says, Ben at once proceeded to Perrant's claim farther down in what is now downtown St. Paul and bought it for $10. And they moved into his unfinished cabin. Perrant apparently liked caves, moved a little bit further down to Carver's Cave to set up his liquor shop. And only a year later, being so far from the fort, Perrant gave up because he had no market and went to California. So one of the things that's interesting about this eviction is that Genevieve and Alphonse were not present. We know they weren't present because they were in Prairie du Chien. They were in Prairie du Chien with the baby because he was brand new, or what about 1 year old, less than a year old here, 6 months old. So on May 10th, 1840, they baptize Basile and Prairie du Chien. So that's a record that places them in Prairie du Chien. And it also reminds us that there's no clergy in St. Paul yet. 1840 is the year that they finally get some clergy. So they're down there. And while they're there, who else is in Prairie du Chien? Their next door neighbor, Edward Phelan, and Genevieve and Alphonse testified to the grand jury in the trial, the murder trial, should we indict Edward Phelan for murder? And they were strongly in favor of Phelan being the murderer, but it was apparently not enough to convict him. There's just not enough evidence, or to have a trial. So Phelan was released. But so those two things are sort of fascinating. We know that Genevieve is down there. She's baptizing a child. They went by canoe down to Prairie du Chien, which is not close, and testified in St. Paul's first murder case. Continuing 1840, so the settlers at Pig's Eye or St. Paul or whatever were actually enumerated twice in the U.S. Census. They were enumerated correctly in St. Croix, Wisconsin Territory, but if you look up the 1840 census, you can also find them in Iowa. So again, people didn't really know what was going on out here, and both of these territories were trying to, boost their populations. The sooner you boost your population, the sooner you can be a state. So why not just count people who are sort of close? They're across the river there, but let's count them anyway. So when Phelan was released, he wasn't indicted. He comes back up from Prairie du Chien. Vital Guerin had jumped his claim, right? He moved into Phelan's cabin thinking he's toast. And so Benjamin now is part of a jury that is deciding whether Vital, who is going to end up with this land. And they reached no verdict, so which I think means that Guerin got to keep the land. So he still got, the Jarvis has still got some payback for the, Phelan not being indicted. They at least kicked him off the land. And now they got a new next door neighbor, Vital Guerin, in downtown St. Paul. So Benjamin had a major role in changing both the name and the character of the city of St. Paul. In the fall of 1841, Benjamin Jarvis and their new neighbor, Vital Guerin, two good, quiet farmers, according to Lucien Galtier, the first priest out here, donated land for the first church of St. Paul. And 8 men, including Benjamin and Pierre Jarvis, volunteered to construct the log church. And so on November 1st, Lucien Galtier blessed the Church of St. Paul, and the name stuck. And they all agreed that, especially since Pig's Eye was shipping out to California, that St. Paul was a better name than Pig's Eye. Other builders of the chapel included Pierre and Charles Bottineau, Isaac and Joseph La Bissonnière, Vital Guerin. The La Bissonnières, when I was doing this searching, they show up in a lot of the same Red River documents. So if you have those people as relatives, you'll find them up there. And the thing to note about Pierre Bottineau, everybody's heard of Pierre Bottineau he founded Maple Grove and Osseo, Red Lake Falls. He was one of the Métis people from Pembina. He had 2 wives in his life. One of them, I think he was the guide that brought the Jarvises down to Fort Snelling in 1838. So he had 2 wives in his life. His first wife was named Genevieve Laurence and was a niece of our Genevieve Laurence. And his second wife, after Genevieve died, was Martha Jarvis, who was a niece of Benjamin Jarvis. So they're very closely connected, these early French-Canadian and Métis families. I should also add that Genevieve's brothers who are out west all married Native or Métis women. So it is sort of, it does stand out that Benjamin didn't marry a Native or mixed blood person. And finally, some quiet years in St. Paul, 1842 to 1844. It wasn't as much drama, but Yankee settlers like Henry Jackson started to show up, and they definitely changed the character of the city. And in 1844, the Jarvises moved up here and founded Little Canada, built the first house, and then built a grist mill. And I like to think of it as a retirement. So after all of that, after the floods, the grasshoppers, these failed businesses, losing money on land, they finally stay put in Little Canada for the rest of their lives. So I like to think of it as a retirement home. Out here in the country, away from the hustle and bustle of the 10 other houses in St. Paul. So here's the grist mill, which I know Little Canada is very proud of. So a couple conclusions at the very end here. They were, I think, good, quiet people. They both had unexpectedly lost a parent when they were children, and in both cases, it dramatically shaped their futures. Benjamin did not go west with the Northwest Company. He stayed to be a part of his those inheritance negotiations. And Genevieve's mother, as a widow, is left alone. Her sons go west. She ended up going west with them, and Genevieve's in tow. Benjamin wasn't the best businessman. He bought and sold land, usually at the wrong time. Even if he'd have hung on to that land in downtown St. Paul, it would have been worth a fortune. If he would have hung on to the land in Montreal, it would have been worth a fortune. He sold it at a loss. So I'm fascinated, I think, most by Angelique Laurence and her just her whole life story and how she's in so many documents on her own. And that both Benjamin and Genevieve were completely independent. Even when they're scraping by, their house has been burned, they did just fine, and their children all survived. And that for the 19th century is itself, an accomplishment. And sort of the last note is I think these families are fairly conservative. They lived, Angelique Laurence lived surrounded by Scots people in the Hudson, on the Red River settlement. What do I have here? They were Catholic, but surrounded by a bunch of Presbyterians. But I think that meant they were really tied to the Hudson Bay Company, to the establishment. In part because Angelique was also in debt. She died 88 pounds in debt. Benjamin didn't marry a native or Métis woman. And what's the other note I have here? And the Laurence family generally sided with the Hudson Bay Company instead of the more radical Northwest Company. So sort of some of the reasons why I think they were a little more conservative. Just your typical sort of conservative values. Stick together, be independent. And then, they were deeply religious. Not only did they help found the church in St. Paul, but they were when the church here in Little Canada got together, the first place they met was the Gervais household. So the outstanding questions, Jean-Baptiste Laurence's death, what happened to Julie, Genevieve's sister Julie, and then that period after he stopped being an independent trader, what happened? Presumably Benjamin had voyageurs working for him while he's doing all of this. You can't just single-handedly paddle your way to Montreal. So I haven't found any evidence of who might have been working for him or with him. I'm curious about that. And that's all I've got. There's a lot here. So I think, do you want to take over here?
Just a few words. Thank you very much. That was outstanding. Thank you all for coming. Again, next door there's coffee and water if you care to stick around and talk to your new friends and relatives. And again,
and I'll be over there. Feel free to talk to me. I'm not in a hurry to get out of here.
Hey, just a quick advertisement. If you're looking to donate to somebody in the name of the Gervais family or the Gervais family, send it to the Little Canada Historical Society. Thank you all very much for coming. Have a great day.